So let's move ahead to an era that covers approximately the 1950s, the early 1950s, through about the mid 1980s. And at this point in time, we had antibiotics, so we could control communicable or infectious diseases. We had the identification of risk factors. What a risk factor is it's a behavior or an environmental situation that increases a person's risk of contracting a disease. So, for example, we know that if you smoke cigarettes, you're at much greater risk of getting lung cancer. We know that if you eat a lot of sugary foods, that you're at greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes. If you don't exercise, we know you're at greater risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Now, does the non-exercise cause cardiovascular disease? We can't say that, but we know that there's a strong association. That's what makes it a risk factor. Now, with smoking, we know that smoking causes lung cancer, so that is beyond a risk factor. But if somebody has smoked, they're at greater risk for developing a lot of diseases. We also have the care of what we'll call high-risk populations as part of our medical care. But in terms of the action framework, the public health system is truly established. And what that means is that the public system for care and control of specific infectious diseases and vulnerable populations is distinct and separate from our general health care system. We have integrated health maintenance organizations with the integration of prevention services into the general healthcare system. The integration of prevention into the healthcare system is a huge movement in terms of keeping populations healthy. And we know that prevention is cost effective, meaning it is much less money to keep a population healthy than it is to take care of them once they are sick. It's also the ethical and right thing to do. So in terms of public health, there is a concept that we need to talk about here. What we're trying to do in public health is to reduce the risk within a population of developing an illness or a disease. And so there are two different approaches, and before we talk about them, I just want to review what many of you may have already talked about in a statistics class, but it's the bell-shaped curve. And generally what this is saying is that just the probability of something occurring, if you repeat it multiple times, falls into a bell-shaped curve. Here is a demonstration of what we're talking about with a bell-shaped curve. So if you drop 100 balls, and this is a computer-generated model, but it happens this way in real life. If you were to drop these balls, the probability that they'll end up at the ends is very small, and that there's a higher probability that they'll fall in the middle, resulting in what you'll see is like a bell-shaped curve. So let's go ahead and play this and see how it plays out. So you can see a few drop off to the side, but overall, as you watch them bounce from shelf to shelf over time, and let's go ahead and fast forward this. See how in the middle, most of the balls are falling in the middle, and it's creating a bell-shaped curve. This is what this has to do with probability, and it occurs all the time under normal conditions. So here we have the last few balls falling, and can you see how we could draw a line to make that bell-shaped curve? So that's one modeling, one simulation, and here is across multiple simulations, and see how they all are forming that bell-shaped curve. So the bell curve, or what is often called standard normal distribution, is looking at the probabilities and the proportion of a population that will fall within a certain area. So considering public health in terms of the two approaches to high-risk populations, the two approaches could be, one, let's provide an intervention that uses the population approach. We encourage everyone to change. The intervention applies to everyone. And so what we're trying to do is move that middle line from low performing to more of a normal performing. That's one approach. Everyone gets the intervention. Everyone is told to exercise. And so we're trying to improve the whole population, moving them towards greater health. That's one approach. Another approach is to look at this end here, or what's called the high-risk population, those people that are most at risk of developing a disease. And let's target them to try to reduce their incidence of premature illness or death. That's a risk reduction approach. You're trying to move high-risk individuals into the normal range, trying to move them from high into normal, versus a population approach, which is addressing the entire population and trying to move them as an average to a normal risk. So then the question becomes, do we provide services for the entire population, or do we try to address and target populations that are at higher risk, those that we would consider vulnerable? This is a very important question in public health because we have limited resources. And we will find when we look at the social determinants of health that there are individuals that have more need for services because they are not starting at an equitable starting point. The next era goes from about the 1950s to the mid-1980s, and this is where we're trying to fill in the holes of this medical care system. So we have antibiotics, we have randomized controlled trials, we know about risk factors. By this point, the Surgeon General, Koop, has determined or has made the statement that smoking causes cancer. We have the Framingham study on cardiovascular risk factors, which we will look at a later chapter. Also HMOs, things like Kaiser and community health centers with integrative programs are providing general health care to the populations. And if you think about Kaiser and their marketing, which is currently Thrive, they are definitely trying to provide prevention and the prevention piece for the population.